Good afternoon. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Wednesday afternoon lunch and learn. I apologize for being a little bit late, but it's very good to be with all of you. I hope that you're taking very good care of yourself during these very trying times. We have been doing some studying together, and it is my pleasure to welcome you back. We've been learning the classical prophets of the biblical tradition, and I think certainly something that's terribly relevant for these days. So I'm really glad that we could be together, and I hope that you're going to find these sessions very helpful and at least enlightening and opening your eyes. The prophet we're looking at today is Jeremiah. As we pointed out last week, Jeremiah is the most personal of all the prophets. He's the one who confesses the most about his own inner life. He's the prophet who is going to begin prophesying some years before the destruction of Judea, before the destruction of all that is precious to him. And he sees it in his nightmares. Beginning in his 17th year, I argued this last week, that the essence of Jeremiah's prophecy is that every night he goes to sleep and he is in Jerusalem as it's being destroyed. He sees the invading armies. He feels the hunger of the siege. He sees the failure of its defenders. He watches its walls crumble. He sees its people being slaughtered. Everything that's precious to this man is destroyed in his nightmares night after night. And he puts in every ounce of his energy to warn the people against this, to pray for their repentance, to ask for their repentance, to push them so hard to change to change their ways, but they won't do it. And finally, he actually witnesses the destruction of Jerusalem. He witnesses everything that he saw in his nightmares, and he changes his tune. He turns from a prophet of rebuke and warning, a prophet who castigates his people for their sinfulness and their faithlessness, who warns about a coming destruction. He turns from that into a prophet of hope, a prophet of reconciliation, a prophet who promises a redemption. It's a powerful, powerful prophecy, and the book of Jeremiah is a powerful, powerful book. Last week, we saw the beginning of his prophecy. We heard some of his words of castigation. And I pointed out to you something that happens, I think, at the end, where he confesses that it's all been a nightmare to him. Today, what I'd like to do is to imagine Jeremiah in Jerusalem in those last days of Judea, those last days of Jerusalem's independence. The Babylonian armies are massing to come down on Jerusalem. The prophet is shouting for the people to change, and the people are pushing back. We don't have a full account of this. We have some of the words in the prophet Jeremiah. We know that he got arrested. We know that he was put in jail. We know that he was bailed out by his uncle. We don't know what happened at the very end. We don't know what happened when the invading armies of the Babylonians came. There is some indication that he died, that Jeremiah was taken to Egypt and he died there. Whether he went there as a refugee or taken there as a captive, we don't know. But I want to imagine that scene. And I want to imagine the argument. In fact, I want to do this in an even more vivid way. I want to imagine Jeremiah on trial. What is the trial of Jeremiah about? It is about the charge of treason. The people, Jerusalem, are going to charge him with treason. And he's going to charge him with treason because Jeremiah is going to say to the people, give up. That the Babylonian emperor is coming. The Babylonian armies are coming. We can live under the Babylonian regime. We can live under a foreign regime. We can live as a politically powerless people because we possess a different kind of power. The power of faith, the power of a spiritual community to hold fast to its way of life, the power of a people of Torah to live a life of Torah. We don't need sovereignty. Now, in our modern ears, this sounds terribly heretical. And that's because from Jeremiah's time until about 1896, Jews lived without sovereignty. I'm going to give away the end now. Jeremiah won the argument. The argument was, do we need sovereignty to live? Are we a polity? Are we a political entity that needs a land and a government and an army and power and a flag? Or are we a faith community that can live under any other power as long as we have the freedom to practice Torah, to teach our children our traditions, to pursue the life of our internal community without too much interference from the outside. Jeremiah's philosophy, arguing that we are a faith community and no longer a polity, is what made it possible for Jews to survive diaspora for 1,800 years. Because had we been a polity, if it hadn't been the Babylonians, it would have been the Persians. If it hadn't been the Persians, it would have been the Greeks. If it hadn't been the Greeks, it would have been the Romans. If it hadn't been, we would have been destroyed many, many, many times over. It was only Jeremiah's insistence that was accepted as the standard operating procedure of the Jewish people, that we are not a polity, at least not a polity in need of sovereignty, that we are in fact a faith community that can survive under any circumstances, that made it possible for us to float over the waves of history. Yes, it's true, we suffered terribly. We suffered oppression, persecution, pogrom, expulsion, inquisition, torture, and ultimately, yes, Holocaust, because we didn't have sovereignty. But otherwise, we wouldn't have survived at all. And it was in 1896 that another prophet arose, whose name was Theodor Herzl, and said the world has changed now. It's no longer the world of Jeremiah. It's no longer the world of Yochanan ben Zakkai. We'll meet him in a few moments. It's no longer the world of the rabbis of the Middle Ages. Things have changed now, and it's necessary for the Jewish people to return to sovereignty, because anti-Semitism is different. Herzl pointed out that anti-Semitism during the Middle Ages was religious, and you could escape it by converting to the religion that they asked you to convert to. If you converted to Islam, if you converted to Christianity, more or less, they would leave you alone, more or less. But in modernity, it's not religious anti-Semitism anymore. It's racial, as it were, it's economic, and it's national. And ultimately, if you're a Jew, he said, at least in Europe, you can't convert to become a French person, a Frenchman. You can't convert to become English. You can't convert to be German or Austrian or Prussian or Italian. They will not accept you. You will always be one step away. It's exactly what Hitler ended up saying. We have people who lived in Germany for 700 years, and they weren't German enough for the Germans. People who lived in England, people who lived in France suffered anti-Semitism because they weren't French enough. They weren't English enough, even though in many cases, they were more English than the English and more French than the French. Anti-Semitism had changed, said Herzl, and therefore it's time to change our modus operandi, our way of operating, and therefore we need to return to sovereignty, because only as a polity, as a nation state with an army, can we gather sufficient power to protect ourselves. And so we changed. And that's the arc of Jewish history. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. From Jeremiah to Yochanan ben Zakkai, across the ages and Middle Ages, to Herzl, David Ben-Gurion, and the founding of the State of Israel. But let's go back to Jeremiah. So what is Jeremiah saying? Jeremiah is watching the Babylonian armies massing, and he says to the people, you can't win this. Give up. And that had to be seen as treasonous to the people among whom he lived. So let's take a look inside. This afternoon, we can look inside at some of these texts. Let me see if I can find it here. Just a moment. Just a moment. There it is. I can do this once again. Sorry. There we are. Here's the prophet Jeremiah. We started learning this last week. Jeremiah we talked last week about the warnings of the Torah and Jeremiah's call to prophecy, the charge he quoted in front of the temple. Look then at chapter 16. Great and small shall die in this land. They shall not be buried. Men shall not lament, nor gash themselves, nor tonsure themselves for them. They shall not break bread for a mourner, no comfort bereavement. No one offer a cup of consolation. He's a dark prophet. And the prophecy that he's offering us is, there will be no hope. There will be no hope. In this destruction that is coming, there'll be no one. And at the end of that statement, for thus says the Lord God, I'm going to banish you from this place. In your days before your eyes, the sound of mirth and gladness, the voice of bride and groom. Lo yishama bi'arei Yehuda b'chutzot Yerushalayim, kol sason v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala. The land will never again ring of the sound of joy. And when you announce these things to the people, they'll ask you, why has the Lord decreed this fearful evil? What iniquity and what sin did we commit? And they'll say, because your fathers deserted me, declares the Lord, and follows other gods and worship them. They deserted me and did not keep my instruction. And you have acted worse than your fathers, every one of you following the willfulness of his heart and paying no heed to me. Therefore, I will hurl you out of this land to a land that neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you will serve other gods day and night, for I will show you no mercy. That's brutal. And what is the sin? I'm going to suggest to you today that the sin is worshiping sovereignty. That sovereignty, that is having our own country, that having our own army, that having our own flag, that thinking that our own political status in the world is a definition of our identity. That's the sin he's talking about. Listen to what Jeremiah is told to do. Now, the context here is that the Babylonians are coming, and the king of Judah is invited to join an alliance of the other small nations around in order to repel the Babylonian invasion. Jeremiah knows this to be futile. He knows that this is never going to work. And so he is sent into the conference. There's a sort of war conference, a war council convened by the kings. And he's sent into this war council by God in order to proclaim a message of surrender. Now imagine this, the generals and the kings are gathered. And they're talking about coordinating their efforts as allies against the arriving invasion. And comes this prophet and says, it's never going to work. Thus said the Lord to me, chapter 27, make for yourself thongs and bars of a yoke like an ox wears, and put them on your neck, and send them to the king of Edom, the king of Moab, the king of the Ammonites, the king of Tyre, the king of Sidon. Those are all the local kingdoms who have come to King Tzidkiyahu of Jerusalem, and give them this charge to their masters. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, say this to your masters. It is I who made the earth and the men and beasts who are on the earth, and by my great might and my outstretched arm, and I give it to whomever I deem proper. I herewith deliver all these lands to my servant, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now, can you imagine how this sounded? This is the worst of treason. The God of Israel calls Nebuchadnezzar his servant and declares that the promised land, the land given to Moses, the land promised to Moses, given to Joshua, given to the Jewish people, the land ruled over by King David, and Zedekiah, Tzidkiyahu, who was the descendant of King David, is given over to whom? My servant, King Nebuchadnezzar? This is high treason. This is the most treasonous thing you could act. I even give him the wild beasts, says God. All nations shall serve him, his son and his grandson, until the turn of his land comes, when many nations and great kings shall subjugate him. The nation or kingdom that does not serve him, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and does not put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation I will visit, declares the Lord, with sword, famine, and pestilence, until I have destroyed it by his hands. You are not fighting Nebuchadnezzar. You are not fighting against the armies of the emperor of Babylon. You are fighting against God. God's on his side. God is sending him into this war. Now, if I were the prosecuting attorney at the trial of Jeremiah, this is all it would take. This seems to be classic statement of treason. It's treason. And in case you miss it, he goes on, because you see, Jeremiah wasn't the only prophet. There were other prophets who spoke differently, right? So look down for a moment with me at let's continue here then. And one of the prophets who spoke opposite was a man named Hananel, right? And so Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah knows that he is up against these other prophets, and these other prophets are egging on these kings to enter the battle, and they're telling the kings exactly what they want to hear, that they're great kings, that their armies are invincible, that the gods of their people and God of Israel is on their side. These other prophets are giving them all of the news they want to hear. And Jeremiah is the lone voice saying, don't do this, saying, lay down your weapons, accept the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar and you will live, fight against him and you will die. As for you, give no heed to your prophets, augurs, dreamers, diviners, and sorcerers who say to you, do not serve the king of Babylon, for they prophesy falsely to you, with the result that you shall be banished from your land. I will drive you out and you shall perish, but the nation that puts its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serves him will be left by me on its own soil, declares the Lord. Well, what's going to happen? There was another prophet. The story here, I didn't give you the whole story here. The prophet, there's a man named Hananel who shows up. And Hananel comes along with a hatchet and he breaks the yoke off of Jeremiah's back. And he says, thus says the God of Israel, I will break the yoke of Babylon. You will be victorious. Go to war. You have God's blessings. Now, who are they going to believe? Who does a king want to believe? The guy who says your armies are invincible, you are a great and powerful king, you are blessed by the God of your people, go to war, I proclaim your war victorious? Or the guy who says put your neck under the yoke of this invading emperor, you haven't got a chance? Of course, they're going to believe the positive one. They're going to believe him, because who doesn't want to believe that? The priests and prophets and all the people heard Jeremiah speaking these words in the house of the Lord. And when Jeremiah finished speaking all that the Lord had commanded him to speak to all the people, the priests and the prophets, and all the people seized him, shouting, you shall die. It's dangerous being a prophet. It's dangerous speaking truth to power. We glorify these people, but it's terribly dangerous. I read somewhere that of all the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, every one of them lost a child in the War of Independence. I'm not sure that's exactly true, but the point is made. To stand up to King George, to stand up to power, takes tremendous courage. Because who wants to hear this? Nobody wants to hear this. And power comes rolling back. Well, here is Jeremiah speaking words of dissent, words of tochecha, words of rebuke. How dare you prophesy in the name of the Lord that this house shall become like Shiloh? That was the northern kingdom. And the city made desolate without inhabitants. And all the people crowded around Jeremiah in the house of the Lord. And he was arrested. And you can see why he was arrested. And the trial of Jeremiah must have featured this testimony. Now, what was the other side? The other side said, look, God has promised us that we are the chosen people. God has promised us that we are in fact blessed and protected. This is God's city. This is God's house, the temple of Jerusalem. Nothing bad can happen to us. We are outside of history. No invading army can take this place. We have nothing to worry about. And it was Jeremiah who keeps coming back and saying, no, you haven't got a chance. You haven't got a chance, because the covenant, you've misread the covenant. You're reading the covenant in an absolutist form, that it blesses you under all circumstances. It's not absolutist. It is conditional, conditioned on your obedience. And therefore, you haven't got a chance. Listen to the next section, which I think is equally remarkable. So he writes a letter, and he sends this letter to the priests as they're going into exile. So the Babylonians are going to come, and the Babylonians are going to exile the king and the queen and all. And he says to them, thus says the Lord God, look at the fourth verse, right? To the whole community of I, which I exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit, take wives and beget sons and daughters, take wives for your sons, give daughters to husbands, that they may bear children, multiply, don't decrease, and seek the welfare of the city to which I've exiled you. Exile, he says, you can bear. It isn't the end. This is all the consolation that Jeremiah can offer. Now, to be this prophet has got to take a toll. And of all the prophets, Jeremiah is really the only one, with the possible exception of Jonah, who lets us know what it's like. Listen to his pain. Listen to the man who wakes up every night in a cold sweat, seeing the destruction of all that's precious to him in his nightmares. Listen to that, and listen to the pain of having to stand before the populace and preach this message and being castigated and rejected and jailed and pummeled. Woe to me, woe is me, my mother, that you ever bore me, a man of conflict and strife with all the land I have not, with all the land I have no lent, I have not borrowed, yet everyone curses me. You entice me, O Lord, I was enticed. It's an interesting word. The word entice means to seduce. It means to rape, basically. You overpowered me. You raped me. It's a terrible image. It's a brutal, brutal image. And you prevailed. That God had overcome him in the way that a rapist overcomes a victim. And I've become a laughing stock, constant laughing stock. Everyone jeers at me. For every time I speak, I must cry out, must shout, lawless and repine. I have no choice. These words are in me and they come out. For the word of the Lord causes me constant disgrace and contempt. I thought, I will not mention him, no more will I speak his name. But his word was like a raging fire in my heart, shut up in my bones. I could not hold it in, I was helpless. I heard the whispers of the crowd, terror all around. Let us inform against him, and my supposed friends are waiting for me to stumble. Perhaps he can be entrapped, and we can prevail against him and take our vengeance. Accursed be the day that I was born. Let not the day be blessed when my mother bore me. Accursed be the man who brought my father the news and said, a boy is born to you, and gave him such joy. Let that man become like the cities the Lord overthrew without relenting. Let him hear shrieks in the morning and battle shouts at noontide, because he did not kill me before birth, so that my mother might be my grave. Oy. And her womb big with me for all time. For why did I ever issue from the womb to see misery and woe and spend all my days in shame? The prophet who must prophesy these words of treason feels that this is the most horrifying thing he's ever had to do. And he complains to God, cursed be the day that I was born. What a man filled with despair. Because on the one hand, he's rejected by everyone, because no one wants to hear this message. And on the other hand, he knows it's true. He knows what's coming. It's not a premonition. It's not a hunch. It's not a hint. It's not a gamble. He knows. He sees it. And yet, he can't help himself. And he can't help his people. Because no matter what he says, they won't change. And so here's the denouement. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the 10th year of King Tzidkiyahu, the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar. It's interesting. Look at the date, by the way. He's dating his prophecy by Nebuchadnezzar's rule now, because he knows that is now the reality in which he lives. In that time, the army of King Babylon besieged Jerusalem, and the prophet Jeremiah was confined in prison attached to the palace of the king of Judah. For King Tzidkiyahu of Judah had confined him, saying, how dare you prophesy? Thus says the Lord, I'm delivering the city into the hands of the king of Babylon, and he shall capture it. That's what we saw before in chapter 27. And King Tzidkiyahu of Jerusalem shall not escape from the Chaldeans, that's the Babylonians, and he shall be delivered into the hands of the king of Babylon. Jeremiah said, the word of the Lord came to me, Hananel, the son of your uncle Shulam, will come to you and say, buy my land in Anatot, for you are next in succession to redeem it by purchase. So he's sitting in prison. Zedekiah, the king, has put him in prison. The Babylonian army has come in and sieged the city. Its defenses are falling, just as he prophesied. But he's kept in prison because he's the traitor. And there in prison, God comes to him and says, your uncle Hananel has a piece of land in Anatot, your hometown. I told you last time, that's French Hill in Jerusalem. And in the custom of the people of Israel, the custom of the Bible, before a piece of land can be sold to anyone outside the family, it has to be offered for a right of first refusal to someone in the family. So Hananel, God says, is going to come to you and offer you the piece of land. Now, mind you, Nebuchadnezzar is literally at the city gates. Nebuchadnezzar is about to take the land. The people are about to go into exile. The land is going to be a battlefield. It's going to be desolate. And God says, Hananel is going to come and sell you the land, right? You're the next one to buy it. And just as the Lord had said, my cousin Hananel came to me in the prison and said, please buy my land in Anatot in the territory of Benjamin, for the right of succession is yours. You have the duty to redeem it. Buy it. Buy it. God says, buy it. Why would you want to buy a piece of land? In the middle of the battle, in the middle of the destruction. Why would you invest in real estate in a place that's going to be a desolate battlefield? And then I knew it was indeed the word of the Lord. So I bought the land and I weighed out the money, 17 shekels. And I wrote a deed and I sealed it and I witnessed it. And I weighed out the money on a balance and I took the deed and I sealed the text and opened it according to it. And I gave the deed to Baruch, that's his assistant, in the presence of my kinsmen. And in the presence of all whose name were named and all the Judeans sitting in the prison contract. So his fellow prisoners are the witnesses to this land contract that's concluded in the prison. In their presence, I charged Baruch. Baruch's his assistant, Jeremiah's scribe. Thus says the Lord of hosts, God of Israel, take these documents, the deed of purchase, the sealed text, the open one, and put them into an earthen jar that they may last a long time. For thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, houses, fields, vineyards shall again be purchased in this land. Because this is the most powerful statement he could make, that destruction is not permanent. And now he turns to a different message, a message of relief, a message of redemption. I'm going to bring her relief and healing. I will heal them and reveal them abundance of true favor, and I'll restore the fortunes of Judah and Israel. I will build them as old, and I will purge them of all their sins they committed against me, and pardon all the sins they committed against me, which they rebelled against me. And again, look at the end. There shall be heard in this place which you say is ruined, without man or beasts. Yes, in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem that are desolate, without man, without inhabitants, and without beast. Kol sason v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala. Od yishama b'yarei Yehuda. Once again, these streets and these towns, these hills, will ring with the sound of joy and gladness of bride and groom, the voice of those who say, give thanks to the Lord, for the Lord is good. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki leolam chasto. As they bring thanksgiving offerings to the house of the Lord, I'll restore the fortunes of this land as of old, says the Lord. That is Jeremiah's prophecy of hope in the face of the terrifying destruction. But I want to go back to the theology, because the theology is so very important. What's he saying? The sin that Jeremiah is condemning, the principal sin, is the sin of holding on to sovereignty as an idol, holding on to the epaulets and the flags and the weapons and the shields and all of the emblems of sovereignty as if they were holy objects, holding on to sovereignty as if it were the be-all and end-all, instead of holding on to the Torah of God. And it was Jeremiah's perception that we could survive exile as long as we were prepared to give up sovereignty, and that the sin of the king and the sin of his household and the sin of the land of Judah was holding on to sovereignty. And what's so interesting is that the exact same circumstance is coming back again. So quickly, here's the history. In 586, the Babylonians came and they destroyed the Holy Temple. And the Israelites, the principal leaders of the Judean community in Jerusalem, were exiled to Babylonia. And there they sat and there they wept. But they did as Jeremiah said. They built homes and they built businesses and they built communities and they built families and they prospered there by those waters of Babylon. And within a few years, within 70 years, Babylon was in turn conquered. It was actually just supplanted. It was a bloodless coup by the Persians who came. And the Persians saw that holding the eastern flank or the western flank of their empire was actually in their interest. And so they invited the Jews to return to Eretz Yisrael, to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. The king, the emperor of Persia, actually sent two bureaucrats, first Ezra, his scribe, and then Nehemiah, his cupbearer, his advisor, back to Jerusalem to assist in the building of the temple of Jerusalem and the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And that begins what we call the Second Temple period. First temple, built by King Solomon, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Second temple, built by Ezra and Nehemiah and the exilic community that returned and stood from 444 BCE until the Romans came. The Romans come and conquered Jerusalem. We have the Maccabees in 166 BCE when we returned to sovereignty. But in 64 BCE, 64 before zero, the Jews of Jerusalem give up sovereignty to the Romans. And the Romans come and they govern Judea as a Roman colony. And they govern it terribly poorly. And in the year 67 CE, 67 after zero, so the Romans come 64 before zero. In 67 after zero, it's 130 years or so, the Jews of Jerusalem revolt against the Romans. They rise up against the Romans. Now, there was a big controversy in the city. Should we revolt? The rabbis, the Pharisees, who were then become the rabbinic community, counseled as Jeremiah did, give in. Don't revolt. Yes, the Romans are inept. Yes, the Romans are cruel and oppressive, but you don't want to anger them because we have no chance against them. And we can live lives as Jews under Roman hegemony if we're careful. But it was a group called the Zealots who were in some sense proto-Zionists because they believed that control of their own land was necessary if they were ever going to worship God with a pure heart. They needed to control the land. And so the Zealots begin to start picking off Roman officials. The Zealots begin picking a fight with the Romans. And then soon the Zealots gather the populace in all-out rebellion. Well, what happens is a rebellion, the Romans see that this is a terrible threat because this was the eastern end of their empire, the boundary between the Romans and the Persians who were just to the east. And the Romans couldn't stand the fact that they might lose Jerusalem. So what do? They land their most powerful army, the 10th Legion in Phoenicia, under Vespasian, their best general, who marches down the coast and marches up the hills and besieges the city of Jerusalem. The suffering in Jerusalem is horrifying. And the rabbis who are trying to make some sense of this, they know something must be done. And so we have a scene sketched for us in the Talmud in Gittin. This is in the Talmud. It tells the story of what happened during that Roman revolt in the Roman response to the Jewish revolt in the year 70. So if you're keeping score, Jeremiah's 586 BCE, that's when the temple's destroyed the first time. This is 655 years later, in 70. The Zealots were in the city. The Zealots controlled the city. The rabbis said to them, let's go out and make peace with the Romans. Let's get this over with. We're going to die. The Zealots would not let them. On the contrary, they said, let's go fight. They rile up the people to fight. It's the same argument that Jeremiah had with King Tzidkiyahu. And the rabbi said, you will not succeed. So what happens? The Zealots burn the food stores that are kept in the city. and a famine ensues. Now, why'd they burn the food stores? Because they knew that as long as the people had food, they would never join the revolt. In order to get everybody involved in the revolt, they made everybody starve to death. And this was lunacy. But this is what happens when Jews fight Jews instead of fighting their enemies. Abba Sikra, the head of the Zealots in Jerusalem, was the son of the sister of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So now understand, this isn't just a political fight between the militant Zealots and the pacifist rabbis. This is a family fight. This is mishpacha. And by the way, if this sounds familiar to you, remember the book and the movie Exodus, where the leader of the Irgun is the brother of the leader of the Haganah, right? Yes, that's the same argument. So Abba Sikra, who is the leader of the Irgun, the rebels, the militants, is the nephew of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is the leader of the pacifists. Yochanan calls him and says, "Come see me." And when he came and saw him, he said, "How long are you going to carry on this way and kill all the people with starvation?" And he replied, Abba Sikra says, "What am I supposed to do? If I tell my guys to give up the fight, they'll kill me." Abba Sikra, who was the commander of the Zealots, has lost control of his own forces, and therefore he's lost control of the circumstances. Devise a plan for me to escape. Perhaps I can save a little. So Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "Get me out of the city. Maybe I can do something." He said, "Pretend to be ill. Let everyone come to inquire about you." This is Abba Sikra telling Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai how to get out of the city, because the Zealots wouldn't let anybody out of the city. They wouldn't let anybody out of the revolt. Bring something evil, let them tell everybody that you're dead, then let your disciples get under the bed, but no others, so they should not notice that you're still a little bit lighter, because they thought that corpses were heavier. And they did so. Rabbi Eliezer, who was Rabbi Yochanan's student, got on the front one side, Rabbi Joshua on the other. When they reached the door, they wanted to pierce the body. And they said, "What, you would do this to our master?" And so they opened the town gate. And in that way, pretending to be dead, Yochanan ben Zakkai sneaks out of the city of Jerusalem, out of the revolt, and he goes to the Romans. When he reached the Romans, they take him to Vespasian, the general. So now this is not news. This is an imaginary scene. I mean, if this happened, I hope it happened. But imagine this scene. These are the rabbis telling the story. The rabbi, who's the leader of the pacifist group, is standing in front of Vespasian, the general of the Romans. He says, "Peace to you, O king, peace to you." Vespasian says, "Your life is forfeit on 2 counts. One, because I'm not a king and you call me a king. And the other, if I am a king, why didn't you come see me before?" And Yochanan says to him, "You have to be a king, because our tradition teaches that only a king could deliver Jerusalem. So you're going to be king." And then he says, "As for your other question, why didn't I come before it? It's because the Zealots wouldn't let me." And now an interesting Talmudic discussion between Yochanan ben Zakkai and Vespasian. Vespasian now, as a Talmudic rabbi, says, "You tell me that the Zealots wouldn't let you. Let me ask you something. If there's a jar of honey round which a serpent is wound, would they not break the jar to get rid of the serpent? If you're telling me that the Zealots control things in the city to such an extent that you, the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the leader of the rabbis, couldn't get out of the town, then what you're telling me is I have to destroy the city in order to pacify it." Rav Yosef, he couldn't give him an answer, says. Yochanan couldn't tell him what to say. Rav Yosef, and many say Rabbi Akiva, who was Rabbi Yochanan's brightest student, offered the verse, "God turneth wise men backwards and make their knowledge foolish." He should have said to him, "No, you don't have to destroy the pot. You take a pair of tongs, grip the snake, kill it, and leave the jar intact. Save the city. Get rid of the Zealots. You can do that." At this point, a messenger comes up from Rome and says, "The emperor is dead, and you've been elected emperor. Mazel tov." Vespasian says to the rabbi, "I'm going now, and I'll send someone to take my place. You can make a request of me, and I will grant it." Do you remember the opening scene of the movie The Godfather? Connie Corleone, the Godfather's daughter, is getting married. And on the day that the Godfather, I promise you this is relevant, on the day that the Godfather's daughter gets married, anyone can come to the Godfather and ask for a blessing or a favor. So what happens? I think it's the baker comes and he wants to get immigration papers for his son, and the undertaker comes and he wants revenge for his daughter who's been shamed by some bad boyfriend, and Frankie comes from Hollywood. He wants the part in the movie. That's the opening scene of The Godfather. The same rule applies here. These are Italians, so I imagine it's the same lineage. On the day that the emperor is announced, you can ask the new emperor for anything, and he has to grant it to you. So he says, ask me anything. So what should he have asked for? Think for a moment. What should he have asked for? Rabbi Yochanan could have asked for the city. He could have asked Vespasian to spare the temple. He could have asked Vespasian to spare the families, the innocents of Jerusalem. He doesn't do that. He doesn't ask for the city. He doesn't ask for the temple. He doesn't ask for the land. He doesn't ask for sovereignty. What does he ask for? Give me Yavne and its scholars. Give me the small town where I can establish a school. Give safe passage to my students so they can go there. Give me Torah. Give me the life of Torah. I don't need a material life in this world. I don't need the land. I don't need sovereignty. I don't even need the holy temple itself. Just give me a place where my traditions can be promulgated. And once again, Rav Yosef, and some say Rabbi Akiva, said to him, why did he ask for that? Why didn't he ask for more? And the answer the Talmud gives is because he thought he wouldn't get it. And even this would not be given to him. But there's something else. There's something else here. And you can see what the real answer is. Because Rabbi Yochanan understood in 70 CE what Jeremiah understood in 586, that the Jewish people would not survive if we're a polity attached to a land, that our material life, the land we live on, the power of the world, political power, military power, is not going to be the way this small people is going to survive the exigencies of history. And that to hold on to that kind of power, to hold on to that kind of existence, would doom us for one destruction or another. The next power to come along and destroy what we have would be the end of us. That the only way to survive is as a people floating on the waves of history. The only way to survive is as a faith community. And of course, this was the way we survived until 1896, when Herzl comes along and says, it's time to return to history. It's time to return to sovereignty, which is our current state, trying to figure out how do we reconcile living as a sovereign people, returning to our homeland with the ethics that we've learned over 1800 years of exile. That's the great challenge. Let's stop here today. And next week we will return. Now that we're in exile, we'll turn to the prophet Isaiah, to the second Isaiah, who's speaking to those of us in exile and telling us how we're going to survive exile and what a return to Eretz Yisrael, what a return to the land of Israel might mean. Thank you for listening today. I want to commend to your attention this evening at 7 p.m. in the Rabbi's study. I'll be joined by my colleague, Rabbi Noah Farkas, and three extraordinary ministers and leaders from the African American community here in Los Angeles. The Reverend Najuma Smith Pollard, of USC, the Reverend Eddie Anderson, and the Reverend Kelvin Sauls, wonderful leaders here, to talk about the demonstrations outside, the Black Lives Matter movement, racism in America, and what we can do to change America. Can America change? That's 7 o'clock tonight here on Facebook Live, and I hope to see you during the course of the week. Thank you very much for listening.